We were all sitting down outside when a boy arrived and said the Krakatoa volcano was erupting, so we all went away and jumped into a car. We were locked inside and then suddenly the window broke and all 11 of us were submerged in water. I was thinking that we would be dead in minutes.
Indonesia is majority Muslim, but Christians there replaced their Christmas celebrations with vigils for the victims. In Kabul, Afghanistan, officials now say 43 people died in yesterday's assault on a public welfare building. Security forces and emergency personnel were still on the scene today, searching for bodies. At least 4 attackers were killed. It's unclear if they were included in the official toll. Police in Khartoum, Sudan today clashed with thousands of protesters. They demanded President Omar Bashir resign after 29 years. The crowds chanted, sang, and tried to march on the presidential palace. Police answered with rounds of tear gas and fired bullets into the air. The protest began nearly a week ago over rising prices and shortages of food and fuel. U.S. immigration officials say an 8-year-old Guatemalan boy died early today in government custody in New Mexico. Customs and Border Protection says he appeared ill yesterday and was taken to a hospital in Alamogordo with his father. He was medicated and released, but returned later and died just after midnight. It is the second death of an immigrant child in U.S. custody this month. In Washington, President Trump insisted again today he won't agree to end a partial government shutdown unless Congress funds a southern border wall. He said his goal is to complete 500 miles of new wall, or quote, renovated border fencing before Election Day 2020. And he said federal workers support that goal.
I can't tell you when the government's going to be open. I can tell you it's not going to be open until we have a wall, a fence, whatever they'd like to call it. I'll call it whatever they want. But many of those workers have said to me and communicated, stay out until you get the funding for the wall. These federal workers want the wall. The only one that doesn't want the wall are the Democrats because they don't mind open borders.
Mr. Trump also said he would travel to the border in January to mark what he called the groundbreaking for a new segment of border wall. Wall Street was closed for Christmas, still smarting from heavy losses on Monday. In Asia, Japan's Nikkei index fell 5%, and markets in China and Thailand also declined. Stock exchanges in Europe were closed. And Christmas Day 2018 brought an annual renewal of religious rites. And in these times of turmoil, empathy was on the minds of many, beginning in the Vatican. In St. Peter's Square, in front of thousands of the faithful, Pope Francis delivered a message of hope and understanding.
My wish for a happy Christmas is a wish for fraternity. Fraternity among individuals of every nation and culture. Fraternity among people with different ideas, yet capable of respecting and listening to one another. Fraternity among persons of different religions. That message echoed in Mosul, Iraq, where Christians were able to observe openly, including with a traditional bonfire, where the Islamic State was defeated a year ago. They also celebrated in Damascus. Syrian Christians, lucky enough to live comfortably in the capital, said the ongoing war didn't disrupt this year's celebration.
For years, we couldn't decorate because of the fighting nearby. We had almost no visitors because people hesitated to come to this part of the city. But now it is different.
Elsewhere, festivities came in all kinds of weather. In Berlin, Santa hat-clad celebrants took a traditional dip in icy waters. In Sydney, and beachgoers posed with a Christmas tree.
I know it's a great sacrifice for you to be away from your families.
At the White House, President Trump sent Christmas greetings via video conference to U.S. troops around the world. Last night at the National Cathedral, he and the First Lady attended Mass. They were scheduled to be in Florida, but stayed in Washington for the second government shutdown just this year. While in Britain, the Queen celebrated a tradition that's been unbroken for 66 years, her annual Christmas message, and her own appeal for empathy.
Even with the most deeply held differences, treating the other person with respect and as a fellow human being is always a good first step towards greater understanding.
Queen Elizabeth also reflected on her 92 years and said, "Some cultures believe a long life brings wisdom. I'd like to think so." Still to come on the News Hour, the financial, political, and legal uncertainty after reports the president is nulling firing the chairman of the Federal Reserve. protests in Iraq over the lack of services in a region rich with resources. Actor Kevin Spacey is charged with indecent assault and pleads his case online. Plus, much more. Ever since reports this weekend suggested President Trump was considering firing Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell over interest rate hikes, there have been many questions about the president heading into what would be uncharted territory. Could he? Would he? And what kind of impact could firing the Fed chair have, financially, legally, and politically? Top members of his team have said Mr. Trump will not attempt it, but the president has been given opportunities to rule out such a move and declined to take them, including today in the Oval Office when he was asked about Powell.
Well, we'll see. They're raising interest rates too fast. That's my opinion, but I certainly have confidence, but I think it'll straighten. They're raising interest rates too fast because they think the economy is so good. But I think that they will get it pretty soon.
The president has repeatedly targeted Powell and the Fed rhetorically over whether interest rate hikes are causing stock markets to dive. Yesterday, he tweeted, "The only problem our economy has is the Fed. They don't have a feel for the market. The Fed is like a powerful golfer who can't score because he has no touch. He can't putt." And President Trump told the Washington Post a few weeks ago, "So far, I'm not even a little bit happy with my selection of Jay." Let's look at the legal questions of whether the president could remove Powell, either as Fed chairman or a member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and what all of this means, with Benjamin Applebaum, who covers the Fed for the New York Times. Thank you very much for joining us on the NewsHour. I guess the first question is, could the president fire Fed Chairman Powell legally?
This is a big question, and there is some disagreement about it. The law says that the president can remove a member of the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors, which includes Jay Powell, quote, for cause. And most legal scholars think that means a president can't do it just because he doesn't agree with the Fed chairman about policy. He needs to have some grounds beyond that. But there's a separate question, importantly, about whether the president could remove Mr. Powell as chairman of the Fed while leaving him on the Board of Governors.
So some kind of demotion almost. Is that separate question? Does that have a separate answer?
So the law doesn't say anything about it, and opinion is more divided. There are some people who think the president has considerable latitude to do that basically for any reason that he would like. There are some people who think that there is a similar amount of protection that the president would need to find some cause beyond a policy disagreement, even to remove Mr. Powell as chairman. That's a much more open question.
So let's keep going with this hypothetical. Even if he were to fire Powell or somehow demote Powell, could the other governors intervene somehow? Could they resist?
So it's a really important point that you're raising, because the purpose of getting rid of Chairman Powell presumably would be to install someone who would lead the Fed in the direction that the president desires. He's said repeatedly that he thinks interest rates are rising too quickly and that the Fed should stop raising interest rates. But it's not at all clear that removing Chairman Powell would accomplish that purpose. In the first place, the other members of the Fed's policymaking committee have been voting unanimously to raise rates along with Chairman Powell. Even if he were removed, there's no particular reason to think that they would change their minds. Indeed, they could even choose to resist the president by retaining Mr. Powell as the chairman of the policymaking committee, even if he were removed as the chairman of the whole Fed.
We should just make a point of that. I mean, none of this has ever happened before, right? We really have no idea how these governors would respond.
We're in completely uncharted waters. No president has ever tried to remove a member of the Federal Reserve's board, let alone a chairman, for any reason at any time. So this is an incredibly theoretical discussion about what the law says. We're in uncharted waters. No one's tried it before.
Because of how uncharted these waters are, there is already political resistance to some of this talk. How extensive is the resistance so far?
It is considerable, and the reason is that the Fed's independence is extremely important to many people. investors value the idea of an independent central bank. They want technocrats to be determining the level of interest rates. They don't want politicians to be making those decisions. The reason that we have an independent central bank is to insulate its decision-making from the vagaries of politics, so that politicians, like the president, can't urge lower interest rates in the short term to goose economic growth at the expense of overheating the economy in the longer term. So that structure is very important, and we've heard a number of senators from both parties on Capitol Hill saying very clearly in recent days, actually in unusually blunt and public terms, keep your hands off the Fed, Mr. President. Do not fire Mr. Powell. Leave the Fed alone.
And I wonder, just in the time we have left, all of this talk, even if it is theoretical, is having a big impact on the markets, isn't it?
It really is. Just the idea that the president is meddling in this, is thinking about it, might do it, has really unnerved financial markets. The president has said that he thinks the Fed is the only thing that's causing consternation in financial markets. I've spoken with a lot of investors in recent days who turn that on its head and say, you know who's causing problems in financial markets is President Trump. The uncertainty that he's creating is rapidly becoming the biggest challenge for the economy.
Benjamin Applebaum of the New York Times, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
This fall, Iraqis in the southern city of Basra took to the streets to protest corrupt leaders and a lack of basic services. Special correspondent Jane Ferguson traveled to Basra, and in the final story in her series Dateline Iraq, she reports how the resource-rich region leaves very little for its residents.
Heading out to protest against his government, this 21-year-old Iraqi knows what he is doing is dangerous. Every Friday, he comes to this spot in Basra with whatever friends still dare to. When these demonstrations broke out in September, they were huge. An explosion of anger at years of poor governance and a lack of basic services. Peaceful protests turned to riots. Municipal buildings were overrun and set on fire. The security forces responded with brutality, killing 12 and injuring hundreds over several days.
My friends and I came here to protest against corruption and to demand our rights, but they are treating us like terrorists or ISIS just because we are against the government. They shot at us with live ammunition, used tear gas, they beat and arrested us. The arrests are still going on.
He's too afraid to share his name and sleeps at friends' houses, fearful of those nighttime arrests. For now, the crowds have died down and the police don't shoot when the protests are this small. But he is trying to keep the momentum. Their demands are simple: a reasonable quality of life and a minimum of government services.
They call us terrorists and say we kill them, but we wouldn't do this. We didn't come here to kill them. We came here to ask for water we can drink, decent health care, and an education for our children. We want Basra to be rebuilt. We want the whole of Iraq to be rebuilt. And we want our share from the oil. These are not demands. These are rights written in the Constitution.
Iraq's southern city of Basra stands as a monument to economic decay. Unemployment, power shortages, and poverty make life here hell. A Shia stronghold, it was neglected under Sunni dictator Saddam Hussein, and since his overthrow 15 years ago, corruption has plagued the city.
Throughout Saddam Hussein's reign, as well as after the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Basra has suffered from enormous underfunding for its infrastructure. Despite the huge oil wealth in the area, the living conditions here are some of the worst in Iraq.
The people here cannot even rely on clean drinking water. This summer, over 90,000 were hospitalized. Treatment facilities and pipelines are in such poor condition that filthy sewage water from the city's Shatt al-Arab River contaminated the main water supply. Even those bathing in the water were poisoned. On our first day in the city, we came across this charity handout of drinking water in a poor neighborhood. Young and old, desperate to get a safe drink. This most basic of needs. As the sun sets over the city, the cooler air draws people out to street markets. Although fewer are protesting now, it's hard to find anyone that isn't angry at the failure of leadership here. Hassan Naif is retired, yet he says it's the young men who struggle the most. Finding decent jobs is nearly impossible.
We have all kinds of young graduates, engineers, scientists. You see them with their degrees sitting on the street without a job. They graduate, they take their degree and put it in their pocket and get jobs doing hard labor. They go and work pushing carts in the marketplace. They do this and they are engineers.
The majority of Iraqi oil wealth comes from Basra, but pumping oil out of the ground creates few jobs, and people here say they don't benefit from the profits either.
The government, they are thieves, they are bad, and the same people keep getting key positions. There is no electricity, no water, and no jobs, and most of us are graduates. We have degrees. At least in Saddam's day, you could have something, some of your rights, but now there is nothing.
We met Basra's deputy governor in his new temporary office because the old one was burned down by protesters. He blames the problems here on the central government in Baghdad.
Since the beginning, we have demanded Basra's rights by asking for a share of the oil profits, petrodollars, and the income from the border ports. But the central government hasn't responded to any of those demands. And if they did, we wouldn't have protests. So it was clearly the fault of the central government. If they had given us what we deserved from the budget, we wouldn't have reached this point.
When protests were at their height in September, Iraq's then prime minister promised to make things better, jobs for the protesters. Those jobs never materialized.
After the protests, representatives from the prime minister's office came to Basra. They talked about giving us 10,000 jobs. So far, we haven't seen one of those jobs of what they told us we would get.
But Basra's problems are not only the result of government neglect. Under the cover of darkness, in Basra's cafes, young men speak cautiously about powerful Shia militias competing with the local government for control. Harith Mohammed, a 28-year-old telecommunications engineer, will only dare refer to these militias as organizations.
The main problem is the competition between the politicians and organizations, because the Basra main important government in Basra has harbors, oil fields. All the companies competed to get work here. When you have a city contain all the resources for the country, everyone try to take control of the city, try to get apart from the city, try to get control on harbor, on oil fields. So if everyone fighting for this city and to take all the rich resources, it will never improve.
But is it dangerous to talk openly about these frustrations?
Yeah, it's very dangerous. No, not anyone can talk about that.
When the Sunni extremists of ISIS swept across Iraq in 2014, they easily overran the Iraqi army. Shia religious leaders called on young men to join militias, often funded by Iran, to fight against the group. Shia heartlands like Basra sent thousands of fighters, many dying in battle. That fight is now over, and the militias have returned home, keeping their guns and refusing to integrate into the regular army. Their leadership has consolidated power and wealth, determined to get payback for their sacrifices in the war. Not everyone is afraid to speak out against the militias. These men waiting by the roadside for laboring work were too desperate to care. Haitham Mahdi works as a foreman on construction sites.
We blame the militia parties, the government. They're the same. Islamic parties, Sunni and Shia, they're all the same. In Saddam's day, we were in a river of corruption, and now we are in a sea of corruption. We are walking toward the unknown. Basra is a disaster. We have diseases, we have environmental issues, we don't have safe drinking water. Water is the minimum of human rights, and we don't have it. Can you believe it? The government cannot even keep a fish alive in the water. How do you expect me to live?
Not far away sit the charred remains of militia headquarters, torched by protesters just as angry at armed groups as they are at the government. In their rage, they also burned down the Iranian consulate too. For now, protests have died down, But anger lingers here. Anger at abuses of power and the neglect of millions. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jane Ferguson in Basra, Iraq.
Stay with us. Coming up on the NewsHour, how personal tragedy led a scholar to question religious faith and then find answers. Why Norwegians are leading the world in electric vehicles. Author Alice Stevens on becoming the subject, not the object, of her adoption. And we ask the military around the world to sing a Christmas classic. Actor Kevin Spacey will face a judge over allegations of assault. More than a dozen men, some anonymously, have accused Spacey of misconduct, harassment, or assault. Now he's facing his first criminal charge when he goes to court next month. The charges against the two-time Oscar winner stem from an alleged incident in July 2016. Spacey's accused of groping the 18-year-old son of a Boston TV anchor. Heather Unruh came forward in November 2017, saying Spacey stuck his hand down her son's pants at a restaurant in Nantucket.
Kevin Spacey bought him drink after drink after drink. And when my son was drunk, Spacey made his move and sexually assaulted him. And I want to make it clear, this was a criminal act.
Spacey faces charges of indecent assault and battery and is due in court on January 7th. But yesterday, shortly after the charge became public, Spacey posted a video on YouTube.
So we're not done, no matter what anyone says. And besides, I know what you want. You want me back.
That's the language of his character, Frank Underwood, from the Netflix political thriller House of Cards. Welcome to Washington. Underwood was killed off the show after allegations against Spacey began in late 2017. And this is the first time he's appeared as the character since.
Despite all the poppycock, the animosity, the headlines, the impeachment without a trial, despite everything, despite even my own death, I feel surprisingly good.
Spacey's last public comments were in October 2017, after his first accuser, 47-year-old actor Anthony Rapp, said Spacey climbed on top of him when Rapp was just 14 years old. At the time, Spacey tweeted, "I honestly do not remember the encounter, but if I did behave then, as he describes, I owe him the sincerest apology. This story has encouraged me to address other things about my life. I choose now to live as a gay man. I want to deal with this honestly and openly, and that starts with examining my own behavior." Spacey also remains under investigation for sexual assault in Los Angeles over an alleged incident in 2016 and faces accusations from his time as artistic director of London's Old Vic Theatre. And to talk about Spacey's unusual response and how other accused men are attempting comebacks, we turn to Alyssa Wilkinson, a film critic for Vox, who's watching a number of these cases and joins me via Skype from Albany, New York. Thank you very much for joining us on the NewsHour. I'll be honest, I'm a little baffled when I watched this video. What was your response?
I was also baffled. I couldn't figure out what he was trying to do, why he was doing it as Frank Underwood, a notorious lying and murdering character, or what the purpose was at all.
Do we have any idea whether this is some kind of comeback?
Well, it's hard to say. What we do know is that Netflix, which carried House of Cards, declined to comment and made it clear many times that they don't want to work with him again. House of Cards is not coming back. But what he could be trying to do is convince a certain number of his fans that he's trying to stage a comeback anyhow, that they shouldn't judge him based on these allegations or other accusations that have been coming forward over the past year. And that they should do this because of the kind of character that he's played in the past.
Could that kind of message be received well by his fans?
I think it's a very small number of people who would receive it well. You know, if you've watched House of Cards, you know that this character is, again, a cheat, a liar. He never says anything truthful unless it benefits him. He murders people to get his way. And so most people, I think, who watch the show know that this character, even if they kind of admire him a little, he's not someone that you're supposed to trust. But with most TV shows about anti-heroes, there is a group of people who watch them and think that's someone to emulate. And you can imagine people finding something kind of interesting or intriguing or honest about this character.
You've been writing not only about this, but also other men who've been accused of misconduct or harassment or assault in the last year and a half or so. How does this moment that it seems as though Spacey's trying to seize compare to some of these other men who've been accused and their attempts to try and get back into the public eye?
Yeah, it's really interesting to look at this. So, for instance, Spacey himself, when allegations first came out against him a year ago, he tried to deflect them by coming out at the same time and saying he wanted to be honest and open and live as a gay man, which was not anything anyone was talking about. They were talking about him making unwanted sexual advances towards a minor. But you can also look at men, for instance, like Harvey Weinstein. When allegations came out against him in October of 2017, his response was to issue a letter that seemed to take them very lightly and say he was going to spend his time fighting the National Rifle Association, which is not related in any way, again. Or you can think about someone like Louis C.K., who has a very different set of allegations against him, but he's been making a comeback in New York, doing sets at comedy clubs. And in his first set that was kind of announced, he made jokes about rape whistles, which seems like an unforced error. Why would you do that? So we kind of see this over and over where men who have been powerful, maybe they've been celebrities, maybe the truth is that they've just been used to kind of not really being connected to reality in a way that has, I don't know, coddled them or given a different sense of who they are and how people respond to them than is actually the case.
So that their fame has somehow allowed them to deflect in the past or somehow think that they can get away with this conduct. But is there any sense that they can get away with it, that have it beyond the point where the fame allows them to do what they've been doing?
Right. Well, this is kind of what we're figuring out right now. We're a little over a year out from when the big Me Too movement began, when all these allegations against famous people started to sort of tumble out. And we're starting to see right now people like Louis C.K., like perhaps Kevin Spacey seems to be doing, trying to make a comeback into the public eye. The question is whether the public is accepting of that, and also I think whether people are looking for a true sense of honesty or self-awareness or something like repentance before they are willing to bring that person back and say, you know, we love you like we used to. And unfortunately, in some of these cases, both Weinstein and Spacey, for instance, you know, they were kind of open secrets in Hollywood. A lot of people knew these sorts of things were going on for a long time, so it wasn't a shocker. And they're very serious allegations.
Yes, they are. Alyssa Wilkinson with Vox, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Why do people with faith believe? And how can they hold on to that faith? Jeffrey Brown recently spoke to Princeton University professor Elaine Pagels at the Miami Book Fair about her new book, Why Religion? A personal story of faith overcoming tragedy.
What is this book? How do you describe it? Because you're well known for scholarly books. This is something different.
This is something I never thought I would do. And I don't think there's a genre for it. Some people call it memoir because it's first person, but it really isn't just that. I didn't want to do just that.
Yeah.
I wanted to interweave the life and the work and show how the work comes out of very specific issues and just talk in a very much more personal way.
That's why I asked, because it is memoir-like.
Very much so. I've always written history and I love to do that. I mean, it's been really fun and I'm still doing it.
Yeah.
But this was an attempt to go back and deal with issues that I had to deal with personally, you know, personal losses that had come up so intensely that I couldn't deal with them at the time. And the way that they're really part of the story.
Part of the story in your early years is of you coming from a more secular background, but discovering religion in an old-fashioned and traditional way through Billy Graham, right? Going to hear him speak.
Well, that will surprise people. There are some
evangelical groups who have called me Elaine Pagan because they think I don't really engage that kind of thing.
Right.
But, you know, the tradition my parents, well, it was kind of culturally Protestant, but my father had no use for religion, and we sometimes went to a church that was essentially boring. But the encounter with the Billy Graham crusade was powerful emotionally.
Yeah.
And also it was very challenging. So I found it like a breakthrough. I sort of plunged at that point at the age of 14 going on 15 into an evangelical group briefly because it was powerful experience. And then I left it after a year and just thought, well, I'm done with that. And years later, maybe 4 or 5 years,
Yeah.
I thought, wait a minute, what was it about that was so powerful? So I went back and I wanted to find out how the Christian movement started and who was Jesus. And then, of course, the story gets much more complicated and interesting because all these secret gospels we never knew about emerged.
Which is the subject that you came out to the world with, and we got to know you.
Yes, and it does make us all aware much more critically of the kind of teachings you find in various churches, because now you know that that's only a small stream of Christianity from a much wider range of sources.
Another part of the personal story, though, that comes along the way is the upfront sexism in the university you encountered. You know, the criticism, of course, even disdain for some of the original work.
It's a minor note in the story, but it's part of what anyone would have encountered at that point in graduate school. Any woman, let me correct that, any woman would have encountered, and many did. So it's just, it's not that it's unique, it was just typical.
So in the most personal sections of the book, the tragedy of the loss of your son.
Yes.
Born with a rare condition, so that you knew he would die early on.
We did. Well, from the age of 2, I mean, he was born with a heart condition. We thought that was repaired. But from the time of 2, we knew that he wouldn't live long.
Yeah.
And that's very hard to live with. He was our only child.
How hard was it to go back and write?
Excruciating. That's why it took me 28 years to do it. I never thought I would. But, you know, there's something about those experiences that they don't just go away unless you engage them and allow them to emerge. So finally, when my children were out of the house, because we adopted 2 children, I had to go back and look at it.
Soon after your son's death, your husband is killed in an accident.
Yes, it was just a mountain climbing accident. And he had climbed for all the 22 years we were married, so I never thought about it.
Yeah.
But it was traumatic.
You're writing about at that time not feeling so close to any sense of particular faith that might help you, but you clearly had to look for what could help you.
I was thinking of William James in his famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and he writes in that book of how he went into a deep depression. I wasn't in that kind of depression. At a certain point, he would cling to sayings like, "The Lord is my refuge." He said, like a drowning man in the ocean clinging to a log. He said, I didn't believe it at the time, but it sort of kept me from drowning. And I had to keep exploring, and the work became a kind of yoga that I love and that I engage in now in so many ways.
Well, what did you learn? And how long did it take you to learn it?
Well, I wouldn't have written the book if I could answer that in a sentence. But one of the things that just amazes me is how resilient human beings are. The things people live through, and what happened here is unusual, but what happens to many other people is even more, excruciating when they deal, for example, with violence, which I didn't. So I'm amazed at how we do those things. And the question is how. I mean, how do we heal?
Yeah.
And that's what this book is about.
Do you buy the idea of getting past the grief, or is it living with the grief?
People say, how did you ever get over it? And I say, what makes you think I'm over it? I think you get through it. That doesn't mean it's over, but it also means that you're not clinging to it or stuck. And that
you probably have people often asking you for advice, like what should I do? What should I practice? What do you tell them?
Well, I think they should go to some practitioner of this of this various traditions. I mean, I think about the Gospel of Thomas, which says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. if you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. I don't think there's a single answer to that. Some people find